He never said much about himself, just fixed engines, changed oil, and sent people on their way with a nod and a fair price. For 30 years, Tommy's Auto Repair sat on the corner of Main and Oak in Cedar Falls, Minnesota, run by a man everyone knew as Tommy, but no one really knew at all. Tommy Hartwell wore the same thing every day: dark blue coveralls, steel-toed boots, and long sleeves. Always long sleeves. Even when July heat made the garage feel like an oven, even when sweat dripped from his forehead onto the engine blocks he bent over, those sleeves stayed buttoned at the cuffs. The locals thought it was just his way. Some figured he had old burn scars from working with engines. Others assumed he was just modest, old-fashioned. Nobody pushed. In a town of 8,000 people, everyone had their quirks, and Tommy's quiet nature was just part of who he was. But on a Tuesday morning in September, that silence was about to be broken by a pair of eyes trained to notice things others missed. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue this powerful tale of hidden service and unexpected recognition, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Marcus Rivera had been back from Afghanistan for 8 months. The transition hadn't been easy. Sleep came in fragments, crowded with dreams of desert roads and the faces of brothers who didn't make it home. His therapist at the VA suggested staying busy, keeping his hands occupied, so Marcus had taken a job at the lumberyard just outside Cedar Falls. His pickup truck, a battered 2003 Chevy that had seen better decades, started making a grinding noise that couldn't be ignored anymore. Everyone in town pointed him to the same place, Tommy's Auto Repair. Fair prices, honest work, they said. Tommy'll take care of you. Marcus pulled into the gravel lot that Tuesday morning, noting the neat organization of the place. Tools hung in precise rows. Parts were sorted by size and function. Oil stains on the concrete were minimal, someone who took pride in their workspace. Tommy emerged from under the hood of a sedan, wiping his hands on a rag. He was in his 70s, Marcus guessed, with gray hair thinning on top and deep lines around pale blue eyes. But he moved with purpose, no wasted motion. "Morning," Tommy said, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes he'd quit smoking 15 years ago. "What can I do for you?" "Transmission's making noise," Marcus replied, patting the hood of his truck. "Probably needs a rebuild, but I'm hoping you can tell me different." Tommy nodded and gestured toward the lift. "Let's take a look." For the next hour, Marcus watched Tommy work. There was something about the way the old man moved under the truck, the systematic approach to diagnosis, the way his hands seemed to know exactly where to reach without looking. It reminded Marcus of something, though he couldn't place what. "You're military," Tommy said suddenly, his voice echoing slightly from under the truck. Marcus paused. He hadn't mentioned his service, and he wasn't wearing anything that would give it away. "How'd you know?" "The way you stand," Tommy replied, still working. "The way you watch the exits, Marine?" "Yeah." "How'd you guess the branch?" Tommy slid out from under the truck, sat up, and looked at Marcus directly for the first time. Takes one to know one. That's when Marcus saw it. As Tommy reached for a wrench, his right sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal something on his wrist. Not a watch, not a bracelet, but numbers. Faded blue ink, amateur work, the kind done in field conditions with improvised equipment. Marcus's blood went cold. He recognized those coordinates. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Tommy's hand moved instinctively to pull his sleeve down, but it was too late. He met Marcus's eyes and saw the recognition there. 17 degrees 30 minutes north, 106 degrees 15 minutes east, Marcus said softly. Tommy froze completely. Those coordinates hadn't been spoken aloud in his presence for over 40 years. "That's Khe Sanh," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "January 1968. For a long moment, neither man moved. The only sound was the radio playing softly from the office, some classic rock station that seemed suddenly inappropriate for the weight of what hung between them. Tommy set down his wrench and stood slowly. "How do you know those numbers?" "I studied that battle in officer training," Marcus said. "But more than that, my grandfather served there. 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines. He talked about a guy who saved his life during the siege, a mechanic who ran spare parts through enemy fire for 77 days straight. Never got decorated because officially, supply runs like that weren't happening. Tommy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Grandpa never forgot the name, Marcus continued. Thomas Hartwell. Said he was 19 years old and fearless as hell. Said he kept more men alive with his wrench than most did with their rifles. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Tommy spoke. Your grandfather make it home? Yes, sir. Lived to be 86, had 4 kids, 10 grandchildren. Talked about Vietnam exactly once in his whole life, and half of that conversation was about you. Tommy turned away, pretending to organize tools that were already perfectly arranged. What was his name? Tommy asked. Sergeant Robert Rivera. He said you fixed his M16 3 times during the siege. Said the last time, you did it while incoming mortars were landing 50 meters away. Tommy's shoulders sagged slightly. Bobby Rivera, kid from El Paso with a picture of his girlfriend taped inside his helmet. That girlfriend became my grandmother. Tommy turned back to face Marcus, and for the first time since the conversation began, something like a smile crossed his weathered face. I'll be damned, he said softly. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd been carrying since he got back from his own war. He said you never talked about what you did. Said you just did it and moved on to the next thing that needed fixing. Wasn't much to talk about, Tommy replied. Trucks broke down, I fixed them. Men needed parts, I got them parts. Nothing heroic about doing your job. Running through enemy fire to deliver ammunition isn't just doing your job, sir. Tommy picked up the wrench again, turned it over in his hands. A lot of good men didn't make it home from that place. Talking about what I did felt like I was taking credit for their sacrifice. Marcus understood. He'd felt the same weight since coming back from Afghanistan, the guilt of surviving when others didn't, the impossibility of explaining what you'd done without feeling like you were claiming more than you deserved. Can I ask you something else? Marcus said. Tommy nodded. Why'd you ink the coordinates? Tommy was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, more distant. Day the siege ended, we lost a good kid. Jimmy Morrison from Ohio. 19 years old, same as me. Stepped on a mine walking back to base after 77 days of hell. Made it through everything just to die in the last 100 yards. Tommy rolled up his right sleeve completely, revealing not just the coordinates but a name below them, J. Morrison. Jimmy always said if we made it out, he wanted to open a garage back home, work on cars instead of military trucks. Live quiet. Tommy's voice caught slightly. When I got back, I figured I owed it to him to do what he couldn't. So I learned about civilian engines, found a small town where people needed honest work and set up shop. Marcus felt his throat tighten. You've been living his dream. Trying to, Tommy said. Some days I do better than others. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 Marines separated by 4 decades, but connected by the invisible threads that bind men who've seen combat together. Your truck needs a new transmission, Tommy said finally, sliding back into professional mode. I can rebuild the one you've got for about $800. Take me 3 days, Marcus nodded. That's fair. As Tommy began gathering tools, Marcus made a decision. Mr. Hartwell, he said, just Tommy. Would you mind if I brought someone by to meet you? There's a guy at the VA, Vietnam vet, who's been having a hard time. Doesn't talk much about his service. I think maybe meeting someone who understands might help. Tommy considered this. What's his story? Tunnel rat, Khe Sanh. Came home in '69 and hasn't talked about it since. His daughter's worried about him. Tommy nodded slowly. Bring him by, but don't tell him about me ahead of time. Let him decide if he wants to talk. Over the next 3 days, as Tommy rebuilt Marcus's transmission, word began to spread in the way that news travels in small towns, quietly, through networks of connection that outsiders never see. Marcus hadn't intended to tell anyone about Tommy's past, but when he mentioned to his co-worker that the mechanic was a Vietnam vet, things began to unfold naturally. The co-worker's father was also a Vietnam vet. That man knew another. That man knew 2 more. By Friday, When Marcus came to pick up his truck, there were 3 other vehicles in Tommy's lot. Their owners sat quietly on folding chairs someone had brought, drinking coffee from a thermos, talking in the low voices men use when sharing memories that still carry weight. Tommy worked with his usual focus, but Marcus noticed he'd rolled his sleeves up. The coordinates and Jimmy Morrison's name were visible to anyone who looked. One of the men, gray-haired with a walking cane, approached the truck as Tommy finished the final adjustments. "You Tommy Hartwell?" he asked. Tommy looked up, wary. "Yeah. I'm Bill Stevens, 1st Cavalry, 68 to 69. I was at Firebase Charlie when your supply convoy came through. You probably don't remember, but you fixed our radio jeep in about 20 minutes with parts you weren't supposed to have." Tommy studied the man's face. Then recognition dawned. "You're the RTO who called in that medevac for the kid with the gut shot." Bill nodded. "That kid was my best friend. He made it because of that radio you fixed." Another man approached. "Dave Martinez, 25th Infantry. You pulled me out of a burning truck near Khe. A third, Jim Walsh, combat engineer. You kept our bulldozer running for 3 months straight so we could keep building bunkers." Tommy set down his tools and looked around at the small group that had gathered. For the first time in 50 years, he was surrounded by men who understood exactly what those numbers on his wrist meant. "I just fixed things," he said quietly. "You fixed us," Bill replied. "All of us, in more ways than you know." That afternoon, after the other men had left and Marcus had driven away in his perfectly running truck, Tommy sat alone in his garage as the sun set through the open bay door. For 5 decades, he'd carried Jimmy Morrison's dream in silence, honoring a fallen brother by living the life that had been cut short. He'd built a good business, earned the respect of his community, and helped thousands of people get back on the road. But he'd done it alone, holding the weight of memory without anyone to share it with. Now, for the first time, he wasn't alone. The next week, Marcus brought the tunnel rat from the VA. His name was Eddie Kowalski, and he'd been fighting his demons alone for 53 years. He and Tommy didn't talk much that first visit, just shared coffee in the comfortable silence of men who'd seen similar things in different places. But Eddie kept coming back. Soon, Bill Stevens started stopping by regular. Then Dave Martinez. Then Jim Walsh. Before long, Tommy's auto repair had become something more than a business. It was a place where men who'd carried their service in silence could finally speak, if they wanted to, or just sit quietly with others who understood, if that's what they needed. Tommy never advertised what had happened. He didn't hang up his service medals or put a sign in the window. The coordinates on his wrist were still the only visible reminder of where he'd been and what he'd done. But word spread, the way important things do in small communities. Veterans from other wars began finding their way to the little garage on Main and Oak. Some came for car repairs, some came for conversation, some came just to sit with men who understood what it meant to serve and then live quietly with the weight of that service. Tommy kept doing what he'd always done, fixing things that were broken, helping people get where they needed to go. But now he wasn't doing it alone. And on quiet afternoons, when the work was caught up and the coffee was still warm, he'd look at Jimmy Morrison's name on his wrist and think that maybe finally he was living the dream the way it was meant to be lived, not in isolation, but in the company of brothers who understood what it cost and why it mattered. Marcus still brought his truck to Tommy for maintenance, even though it ran perfectly now. During one visit, he asked Tommy if he'd ever thought about writing down his stories, maybe for a book or a documentary. Tommy shook his head. "Stories aren't meant to be told, son. They're meant to be lived. But people should know what you did." Tommy looked around his garage at the photographs that had begun appearing on the walls, pictures of the men who'd served, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, all connected by invisible threads of shared experience. "They do know," Tommy said quietly. "The ones who matter, anyway." 6 months later, the Cedar Falls City Council voted to rename the street where Tommy's garage sat. The sign now reads Jimmy Morrison Way, honoring a 19-year-old Marine who never got to live his dream, but whose memory kept another Marine living it for both of them. Tommy was invited to the dedication ceremony. He declined to speak, but he was there, standing quietly in the back while others talked about service and sacrifice and the importance of remembering those who gave everything. When it was over and the crowd had dispersed, Tommy walked to the new street sign, looked up at Jimmy Morrison's name in fresh black letters, and spoke words only he could hear. "We did good, kid. We did real good." Some stories aren't about the loudest voices or the biggest headlines. They're about quiet men who do necessary work day after day, carrying memories and honoring promises that no one else even knows were made. Tommy Hartwell never asked for recognition. He never needed medals or parades or speeches. He just needed to know that Jimmy Morrison's dream was alive, that broken things could be fixed, and that sometimes the most important service happens not in dramatic moments, but in 30 years of showing up, rolling up your sleeves, and doing what needs to be done. The coordinates on his wrist have faded over the years, but they're still there, still visible to anyone who knows how to look, still carrying the weight of a place and time when fixing things meant the difference between life and death. And every morning, when Tommy arrives at his garage before sunrise, he rolls up his sleeves and gets to work, keeping Jimmy Morrison's dream alive one repair at a time. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like Tommy? Someone who served quietly, carried their memories alone, and honored fallen friends through decades of humble service? Share their story in the comments. Tell us their name, because here at the Human Stories, we believe that the most powerful service often happens in silence, and the most important recognition comes not from medals, but from the understanding that passes between those who've served. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who understands what it means to serve quietly. Subscribe to the Human Stories. We're here to honor the men and women who carry their service with dignity, and remember their fallen brothers and sisters through lives of quiet purpose. And next time you meet a quiet mechanic, a humble janitor, or any older man or woman who works with their hands and doesn't talk much about their past, remember, you might be standing in the presence of a hero who never asked to be called one.